Your contract ends today, effective immediately. Sign the termination record and leave the hospital before 12 o'clock noon. Linda, please, don't do this. The midday sun poured down mercilessly onto the sterile front steps of St. Clement Children's Hospital in Boston. Dr. Phoebe Ashford, 29, a single mother, stood frozen at the human resources desk. Zoe, her 6-year-old daughter, sat quietly outside in the corridor, hugging a small backpack, her pale blonde hair falling softly beneath the cold white wash of fluorescent lights. Linda Voss, the chief administrative officer, slid the dismissal notice across the desk with a stare that was icy and blank. Beside her, Dr. Bradley Whitman sat in silence, wearing a face that pretended to be pained, yet beneath the table, his hands were clenched so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. That wasn't the face of a man savoring victory. That was the face of a man running from himself. The system record is objective evidence, Dr. Ashford, Linda said, her voice even, as if she were reading an obituary. Incorrect anesthesia dosage. Owen, 5 years old, nearly died on the operating table. We can't overlook that. Phoebe swallowed hard. She knew she hadn't been wrong. The dosage she administered was nothing like what the record now claimed. Someone had altered the chart, and she knew the person who did it was sitting right in front of her. Records don't lie, Phoebe said slowly, her eyes locked on Bradley. But the person who edits the record does. Bradley didn't answer. He looked away, just a beat too quickly. And Phoebe understood. He didn't only hate her. He was afraid of her, but fear didn't change the outcome. Her badge was confiscated. Her medical license was temporarily suspended. 15 years of struggle, from an orphaned girl in the coal country of West Virginia to one of Boston's leading pediatric neurosurgeons, was reduced to a small cardboard box, a stethoscope engraved with her name, a photo of Zoe on her first day of school, and a handwritten surgical notebook gone yellow at the edges. Phoebe nodded, took the notice, and stood. No pleading, no tears, no lowering herself. She stepped into the corridor. Zoe looked up immediately, her clear blue eyes scanning her mother's face, and she understood everything in a single instant. A 6-year-old child shouldn't be able to read an adult's pain that fast, but Zoe Ashford wasn't an ordinary child. "Mom, your eyes are red. Did you cry in the meeting room?" Phoebe tried to smile. "No, sweetheart, just something in my eye." Zoe tilted her head, her eyes bright with the kind of brightness life can't easily fool. "There isn't any dust in that room, Mom. That room has an air purifier." Phoebe let out a strangled little laugh. Her throat tightened around it, half comforted and half torn open, because it was her own daughter who was having to be strong for her. Zoe was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, her voice small, but each word perfectly clear, "Mom, did you do something wrong?" Phoebe stopped walking. She lowered herself onto the cold tile, level with her daughter's eyes, and took those tiny hands in her own. Then she answered in the steadiest voice she could summon. "No, I did the right thing. But sometimes, sweetheart, doing the right thing doesn't mean you get to stay." Zoe looked at her mother, silent for a few seconds, the kind of silence adults rarely have the patience to wait through. Then she said, "Then you're like Wonder Woman. The bad people chase you away, but you're still the good one." Phoebe pulled her daughter into her arms. She held her so tightly Zoe could feel her mother's heart pounding. Phoebe buried her face in that pale blonde hair so Zoe wouldn't see it. And at last the final tears slipped free. Then she stood. She took the box. She took her daughter's hand. As they crossed the main lobby, Phoebe saw Bradley standing at the nurse's station. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking. He stood alone, holding a cup of coffee he never drank, staring out a window, and when their eyes met, Bradley looked away first. It lasted only a moment, but Phoebe read it anyway. This wasn't the look of a winner. It was the look of someone who'd done something he despised, and realized it was already too late to undo it. Mother and daughter stepped out through the hospital doors. The Boston midday heat fell onto their shoulders, hot and heavy, as if the whole sky were trying to force them to bow. But Phoebe didn't bow. She walked straight ahead, the small cardboard box tucked under one arm, her other hand wrapped firmly around the hand of her 6-year-old. No shuttle car. No colleagues coming out to see her off. Only the two of them, one tall and one small. Their shadows stretched long across the blistering sidewalk, but somewhere far away, in a mansion perched high on Beacon Hill, A man was studying an MRI image of his daughter's brain. His gray eyes gave nothing away, yet his fist was clenched so tightly the bones stood out pale beneath his skin. Beside him, a bodyguard stood motionless and murmured, "Sir, the hospital just called. The only doctor who can operate on this case was fired this morning." The man didn't turn around. He said 2 words, low, level, and so cold the bodyguard had to swallow before he could breathe again. "Find her." And that was how the life of Dr. Phoebe Ashford, the woman who had just lost everything, was about to collide with Kane Mercer, the man who was willing to burn down an entire city if that was what it took to save his daughter. But not yet. Right now, Phoebe was only a single mother, walking home with $847 in her account, a 6-year-old daughter, far too smart for her age, and her hands, those hands the world didn't yet know, were the one thing that could save a life already counting down day by day. If this story touched you, please tap like to support people who choose what's right, even when it costs them everything. Share it so more people can hear this story, and subscribe to the channel, because the next part is when everything truly begins. The walk from St. Clement Hospital to the apartment in Dorchester usually took 15 minutes by bus. Today, there was no bus. No money for a taxi. Only 2 pairs of legs. One aching inside worn flat shoes with scuffed heels, the other tiny inside star-patterned sneakers Phoebe had bought on sale last summer. The Boston midday sun poured straight down from overhead, baking the sidewalk until Phoebe could feel the heat pushing up through the soles of her shoes. In her mind, numbers began to scroll like the patient monitors she knew too well. This month's rent, Zoe's health insurance, unpaid preschool tuition, all colliding, stacking, dragging her under. Zoe walked beside her, occasionally trying to step into her mother's shadow stretched across the pavement, a little game she'd invented whenever she sensed her mother was sad. Each time her small foot landed inside the shadow, Zoe giggled, and that sound pulled Phoebe out of the spiral in her head, if only for a few seconds. They passed a roadside ambulance station, the red and white vehicle sitting silently beneath a tree, its rear doors cracked open, the inside empty. Phoebe looked at the ambulance, and her steps slowed, then stopped completely, not because she was tired, but because that ambulance dragged her backward to an afternoon 14 years earlier, in a place more than 600 miles from Boston, where the smell of damp earth and coal dust coated everything like a curse no one could lift. West Virginia. Coal country. Phoebe was 14, thin blonde hair tied in a ponytail, running along the dirt road leading to mine number 7. Her father, Thomas Ashford, a miner, a man who was never rich but who sat beside his daughter's bed every night, reading until she fell asleep, had once told her, his voice rough from coal dust but warm with love, "That, sweetheart, all I know how to do is dig coal. But you'll dig up something much bigger." That afternoon, the mine collapsed. Phoebe reached the site just as they pulled her father from the rubble. He lay on the brown earth, his chest rising weakly, blood soaking through his gray jacket. Phoebe dropped to her knees, tore off her own old coat, and pressed it against the wound in his abdomen. The blood was warm and sticky, seeping through the fabric, soaking her fingers, sinking into her memory forever. She screamed for an ambulance. The neighbors screamed for an ambulance. Everyone screamed. But the mining town was too remote. Hospitals were too few. The ambulance arrived 47 minutes late. 47 minutes during which Phoebe sat holding that blood-drenched coat against her father's stomach, watching his eyes slowly lose focus, hearing his breathing grow faint, feeling his rough hand squeeze hers, and then release it, little by little, like a wilted petal falling from a stem. The last thing he said, his voice thin as wind, was, "Sweetheart, don't be afraid." Then his eyes closed. The ambulance arrived at 4:23 in the afternoon. 47 minutes. Not because the injury was unsurvivable, but because there was no one skilled enough, close enough, fast enough to save a poor miner in a forgotten place. That night, 14-year-old Phoebe sat alone in an empty emergency room, staring at her hands still smeared with her father's blood, and she swore. She swore in the trembling voice of a child who'd just lost the only person she had in the world, that she'd never let anyone die because there weren't hands good enough to save them. That vow carried her through foster homes, through scholarships, through medical school, through sleepless nights on call, through a specialty board exam, where she was the only one in her class, without family waiting to congratulate her. And that vow carried her to another night, 9 years later, when she was 23, alone in a recovery room, holding her newborn daughter. Her boyfriend, a medical resident, had left when her pregnancy had only just begun to show with a single cold sentence that the baby would destroy both their careers. Phoebe didn't chase him. She didn't beg. She lay in the quiet recovery room, tears falling onto her tiny daughter's forehead, and whispered that you'll never be alone, Mommy promises. Then she stood up and kept going, like she always did. Phoebe completed her pediatric neurosurgery specialty at the top of her class. She developed a distinct microsurgical technique the medical world had called impossible until she proved otherwise. A method for removing brain tumors in locations 99% of surgeons worldwide refused to touch. She was recruited to St. Clement, Boston's leading children's hospital. And there, she met Dr. Bradley Whitman. Bradley, 34, the only son of Dr. Warren Whitman, a member of the hospital board and a living legend in neurosurgery. Bradley grew up in a house where every wall was covered with his father's awards. Every dinner was an exam. Every look from Warren was a reminder that my son must be better than me. But Bradley wasn't better. He knew it. And when Phoebe Ashford appeared, the orphaned girl from coal country West Virginia, no family, no connections, no one backing her, but with hands that made an entire surgical department hold its breath when she picked up a scalpel, Bradley looked at her and saw, with brutal clarity, a mirror reflecting everything he'd never become. Phoebe didn't yet know that mirror would nearly destroy her. Zoe tugged lightly on her mother's hand, pulling Phoebe back into the present. Mommy, what are you thinking about that makes you so sad? Phoebe blinked and looked down at her daughter. I was thinking about your grandfather. Zoe didn't speak. She just squeezed her mother's hand a little tighter. And the two of them kept walking, along the longest road they'd ever traveled. The apartment sat on the third floor of an aging building at the end of the quietest alley in Dorchester, where the paint peeled off the walls in sheets like wounds no one bothered to bandage, and the hallway light flickered on and off in its own private rhythm, as if the building itself were breathing its last breaths. Phoebe opened the door, and the familiar smell of dampness rolled out to meet her, along with the steady, rattling buzz of the old refrigerator, a sound she'd heard every day for 3 years, but today it felt heavier than it ever had. She set the box of her personal things on the kitchen table, right beside a glass of water, still marked with a smear of lipstick from the morning, a glass she'd poured in a rush before being called into the disciplinary meeting and never had the chance to finish. Zoe climbed onto a chair and swung her legs, looking around the one-bedroom apartment as if checking that everything was still intact. Then she turned to her mother with those clear blue eyes, the eyes Phoebe sometimes feared to look into because they were too much like her father's. The man who'd left when Phoebe's belly had only begun to swell by a few inches. Phoebe sat down at the kitchen table, opened her phone, and tapped into the banking app. The number on the screen was cold and unforgiving, $847. She started calculating in her head, the habit of someone who'd spent years counting seconds in an operating room, now turned into counting dollars in an account. Rent, $1,100, due in 12 days. Zoe's health insurance would be cut at the end of the month if the premium wasn't paid. This month's preschool tuition, still unpaid. She added and subtracted and multiplied and divided in her mind, and every equation gave her the same answer. Not enough. $847. The distance between her and the street, between Zoe and the childhood, Phoebe had sworn she'd never allow her daughter to lose. The refrigerator's buzz filled the silence. A weak yellow ceiling light spilled onto the kitchen table, laying a tired wash of color across Phoebe's face. Then a small sound tugged her out of the numbers. The refrigerator door opening. A milk bottle set down. Water poured into a cup. Phoebe looked up. Zoe was pouring herself milk, her tiny hands lifting the heavy bottle that weighed nearly as much as half her arm, tipping it carefully into a plastic cup with a cat on it. Not a single drop spilled. Then she washed her hands, wiped her mouth, carried a pediatric anatomy book over to sit beside her mother, and leaned her head against Phoebe's shoulder without saying a word. 6 years old, pouring her own milk, knowing when her mother needed silence and when her mother needed to be touched. Phoebe wanted to cry, but she didn't dare, because every tear she let fall would become another weight on the shoulders of a child who'd had to be strong earlier than any child ever should. After a long time, Zoe spoke, her voice soft, but strangely steady. Mom, if we don't have money, do we have to sleep outside on the street? Phoebe tightened her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Never, sweetheart. I'll find a way. Zoe looked up and tilted her head, her eyes shining in that particular way children do when they see the world through a clear logic. Adults have long since misplaced. And she said, "You're really good at finding a way, Mom. You found a way to operate on a baby's brain where nobody else dared to operate. Finding a way to make money has to be easier than that, right?" Phoebe laughed. Not the laugh of someone who was happy. The laugh of someone who'd been knocked flat and was being offered a hand by a 6-year-old pulling her back to her feet. She gathered Zoe into her arms, pressed her nose into her daughter's soft curls that smelled like children's shampoo, and thought maybe Zoe was right. Maybe operating on brains really was easier than earning money, because at least in surgery she knew the exact line of the cut, while life never handed her an MRI at all. Outside the window, the sky deepened toward night. One by one, the streetlights along the alley clicked on, casting a faint orange glow into the small room. Zoe fell asleep first, curled into a ball on the bed, blonde hair spread across the pillow, her chest rising and falling in an even rhythm, peaceful enough that Phoebe wanted to freeze the moment and keep it forever. She pulled the blanket up over her daughter, then turned back to the kitchen table and sat alone beneath the weak yellow light. The stethoscope engraved with her name lay in the box, glittering with a cold shine. The apartment was quiet, only the refrigerator's buzz and Zoe's soft breathing from the next room. The only two sounds keeping Phoebe Ashford from falling straight down into the emptiness St. Clement had carved into her life that morning. The hand on the wall clock pointed to exactly 9 o'clock at night when Phoebe's phone vibrated for the first time. She was sitting motionless at the kitchen table, her fingers unconsciously turning the stethoscope engraved with her name inside the box, flipping it back and forth over the 3 letters that had still been her identity that morning, and now were nothing but an etching on cold metal in a dark apartment. The screen lit up. An unknown number. No name. Not in her contacts. Phoebe looked at it and left it alone. Maybe a telemarketer. Maybe a wrong number. Maybe one of the 100 small, unimportant things life kept tossing at people even while they were drowning. The phone went dark. Silence returned, along with the refrigerator's steady buzz and Zoe's even breathing from the next room. Then it vibrated a second time. The same number. Phoebe frowned, but still didn't answer. She didn't have room in her mind for anyone tonight. No space at all for anything but the number 847 and the sleeping face of her daughter. A third time. The phone trembled on the wooden table, making a soft droning sound that, in the stillness of the apartment, felt as sharp as a knock at the door. Phoebe picked it up, her thumb hovering over the answer button, then set it back down. Instinct told her no one called 3 times in a row at 9 o'clock at night by accident, but exhaustion was heavier than instinct. A 4th time. Irritation rose in her. Irritation laced with something she didn't want to admit was curiosity. Who called 4 times in a row and didn't give up? Emergency patients called the hospital, not a doctor who'd been fired. She didn't have many people left who knew her. And strangers had no reason to be that persistent with a woman counting every dollar in an 18-square-meter apartment in Dorchester. The 5th time, the phone didn't vibrate. It went still, but a text message appeared instead. White letters on a black screen. Brief, cold, precise. Not one word too many, and not one word missing. Dr. Ashford, I have a 7-year-old patient. A brain tumor in a location every doctor in the world refuses. Except you. I'll come to see you tonight. This isn't an offer. Phoebe read it. Read it again. Read it a 3rd time. Each time, her heart climbed another step, the way it did when she stood before the MRI of a complex case, and her body began preparing before her mind could catch up. A 7-year-old patient. A brain tumor. Every doctor refuses. Except you. Those words struck the deepest place inside Phoebe. The place where the vow of a 14-year-old girl beside her father's body still smoldered, even after the outside world had tried to stamp it out that morning. But it wasn't the message that sent cold along her spine. It was the voice. This wasn't how a patient or a patient's family wrote. There was no plea, no request, no emotion slipping between the lines. This was the voice of someone used to giving orders. Someone for whom the sentence, "This isn't an offer," wasn't a threat. It was simply fact. Because in that person's world, everything was an instruction, and every instruction was carried out. Phoebe looked toward the bedroom. Zoe lay on her side with an arm around her stuffed bear, blonde hair spread across the pillow, her chest rising and falling softly, in a peaceful sleep she didn't know had just been put at risk. Because whoever sent that message knew where Phoebe lived, knew her phone number, knew she'd been fired that morning, knew she was the only doctor who could do that surgery, and knew she was alone with a 6-year-old in a third-floor apartment with no security cameras. Then she heard it. Not the refrigerator, not the wind, the sound of engines. Heavy, low, not one vehicle, several. The engines grew louder, nearer, and then stopped directly below, sudden and final, like the sound of something arriving not to ask, but to take. Headlights swept across the apartment window, slid along the ceiling, threw a harsh white streak through the dark room, then vanished, leaving the darkness thicker than before. Phoebe stood up, her heart racing. The instinct of a single mother who'd lived in Dorchester for 3 years told her to check the locks. The instinct of a surgeon told her to stay calm, assess, don't panic. But every instinct told her the same thing, that the person who wrote that text wasn't the kind of person who accepted silence as an answer. And that person was right downstairs. The sender of that message was about to change Phoebe Ashford's life completely, but not in a way anyone in this story could possibly imagine. 2 hours had passed since the vehicle stopped downstairs. 2 hours in which Phoebe sat in the darkness of the kitchen, lights off, not moving, listening to every sound from the stairwell like a small animal on alert in its den. She'd locked the door. She'd checked the window latches. She'd moved Zoe from the bed and tucked her farther inside, closer to the wall, as far from the front door as possible. The clock read 11 o'clock at night when 3 knocks landed on the door. Not rushed, not frantic. 3 firm, even knocks, spaced exactly 1 beat apart. The kind of knock made by someone who never had to knock twice, because in his world every door opened on its own. Phoebe stood. Her hand reached for the kitchen knife on the rack, the black-handled vegetable knife she used every day to cut fruit for Zoe, and she hid it behind her back. She stepped to the door, unlatched the safety chain but didn't unlock the main lock, opening it only a narrow crack to see outside, and she saw him. The man in the hallway stood almost a head taller than Phoebe, broad-shouldered, his frame sharply tailored beneath a perfectly fitted black suit that wasn't flashy, the kind of suit worn by someone who didn't need to impress, because his presence already filled the tight hallway. His dark hair was combed back neatly, exposing a high forehead and features cut hard and angular, as if shaped by a blade. But what made Phoebe stop, what made her forget the knife behind her back for a few seconds, was his eyes. Gray. Not gray-blue or gray-brown, but pure gray, the color of unpolished steel, of a sky before a storm, of something that had seen too much death without blinking. Those eyes looked straight at her through the thin crack of the door, not scanning, not searching, just looking, as if he'd known exactly where she would be standing before she ever opened it. Behind him, 2 other men stood as still as statues, black suits, earpieces, faces empty of expression. One of them was Renner, 33, head shaved clean, square jaw, eyes constantly sweeping everything within 10 meters as if anything could turn into a threat. But Phoebe didn't look at the bodyguards. She looked at the man's hand. In his right hand he held a phone, the screen angled outward as if by accident. But Phoebe could tell there was nothing accidental about this man. And on the screen was a photo of a little girl, long black hair, big eyes, grinning wide on a hospital bed. The kind of grin a 7-year-old wore before she understood how sick she really was. The way he held that phone, fingers curled around the edge as if it were the only thing still tethering him to this world, told Phoebe before he said a single word that the man standing in front of her wasn't only dangerous, he was desperate. Dr. Ashford, his voice was low and even, without rise or fall, I'm Kane Mercer, and I need 15 minutes of your time. Phoebe tightened her grip on the knife handle behind her back. Who are you? And why do you know my home address? Kane didn't answer the question. Instead, he spoke in a voice where each word fell like a bullet, precise and impossible to take back. I know more than your address. I know you were fired this morning for a mistake you didn't make. I know your account has $847 left. And I know my daughter will die in 3 weeks if you don't operate. My daughter will die. That sentence, that exact sentence, went through the chain, through the darkness, through the self-protective instincts of a single mother, and struck the place where the vow of a 14-year-old girl beside her father's body was still burning. Phoebe opened the door. The knife stayed behind her back. Kane stepped into the small apartment, his gray gaze sliding across the room only once. But Phoebe knew he'd memorized everything. The window placement, the distance to the bedroom, the knife she thought she'd hidden but that he'd surely seen from the first second. He didn't comment. He simply set an iPad down on the kitchen table, right beside the lipstick-marked glass of water and the stethoscope engraved with her name, and turned on the screen. An MRI image of a brain. Phoebe looked at it and forgot everything else. Forgot Kane, forgot the knife, forgot her precarious situation, forgot St. Clement, forgot Bradley Whitman. She saw only the tumor. An astrocytoma, sitting at the junction of the brainstem and the cerebellum, a location neurosurgeons called the dead zone. Operating here was like disarming an explosive inside a skull, off by a millimeter, and the child would never breathe, never speak, never open her eyes again. 11 of the best doctors in the world had looked at this image and shaken their heads, but Phoebe didn't shake hers. Her finger touched the screen, zooming in, rotating angles, measuring distances with her eyes, and her mouth began speaking before her conscious mind could stop it. Here, if you approach from a suboccipital angle, the risk of cranial nerve damage is 60%. But if you use a retrosigmoid route with real-time neuromonitoring, there's a path. It's narrow, but it's there. She looked up and realized Kane was watching her. Not in the way of someone evaluating or testing. In the way of someone who'd been walking in a desert for 3 months and had just seen water for the first time. You saw in 30 seconds what 11 doctors took 3 months to refuse, Kane said. Still even. But something in him had shifted. Softer, closer, as if for the first time he was allowing himself to believe in something. I came to the right person. Phoebe lowered the iPad. Who are you really? She asked. Not from fear this time, but because she needed to know what she was facing. Kane looked at her, silent for 1 beat. Then he answered, without circling, without excuses, without asking permission. I run everything in South Boston the police can't touch. You know what I mean. Phoebe did. Mafia. She was sitting across from a crime boss in a small, cramped kitchen, her daughter asleep 1 wall away, and the kitchen knife behind her back suddenly felt so ridiculous she almost wanted to laugh, if the situation hadn't been terrifying. Then Kane swiped to another photo on the iPad. Stella, a 7-year-old girl. Black hair, skin pale from chemotherapy, but big bright eyes, smiling from a hospital bed. She was drawing with colored crayons, and even through the childish, crooked lines, Phoebe recognized a house with 2 figures, one big and one small, standing beneath a yellow sun. Stella's smile looked like Zoe's smile, the kind of smile that trusted the world completely, even while the world was betraying them. And Kane Mercer, the man Phoebe had just learned ruled an underground empire with money and violence, stared at the picture of his daughter with gray eyes where, for the first time, Phoebe saw something crack inside, like the first fracture across a frozen lake when spring touches it, he said. And for the first time his voice couldn't stay perfectly level. I've done a lot of terrible things in my life, Dr. Ashford. I'm not asking you to forgive any of them, but Stella, and he stopped, swallowing hard, the swallow of a man who wasn't used to crying, and would never allow himself to cry in front of anyone. Stella is the only clean thing I've ever made in this world, and I'll burn this entire city if I have to, just to put a scalpel in your hands and have you save her. The kitchen went quiet after Kane's last sentence. Phoebe heard every word. She heard the way his voice fractured on the name Stella. She heard the desperation of a father willing to burn an entire city, and it was that desperation that felt most dangerous tonight. Not the knife behind her back, not the 2 bodyguards in the hallway, but the pain inside Kane Mercer pulling her toward an operating room with a gravity reason couldn't resist. But Phoebe Ashford didn't live by emotion. She was a surgeon. She lived by analysis, by probability, by seeing every route before she ever picked up a blade. And tonight, every route led to a cliff. She looked at Kane, straight into the gray eyes, waiting for her answer. Then she said, softly, but with each word as clear as the way she delivered a diagnosis, "No." Kane didn't move. He didn't blink. He only tilted his head slightly to one side, so small it was almost invisible. But Phoebe noticed because she was trained to read the smallest signals in a body, and that gesture told her Kane Mercer wasn't used to being refused, that the word no was a language he had nearly forgotten how to hear. Phoebe went on, not because she owed an explanation, but because she needed to remind herself why she was saying no while every cell in her body was screaming yes. My medical license has been temporarily suspended since this morning, she said. Any surgery I perform right now would be illegal. I could be prosecuted, stripped of my license permanently, barred from practice for the rest of my life. And if that happens, I don't just lose my career, I lose the ability to save any other child in the future, not only your daughter. She paused, drew in a breath, and added in a voice she fought to keep steady, though something was cracking at the edges. And working for someone like you, Mr. Mercer, would destroy whatever I have left. Everything I've built for 15 years from the ashes. Kane was silent. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He only watched her with those gray eyes, strangely calm, the calm of a man who'd weighed every outcome before he stepped into this room, including being turned away. Then he said, slowly, word by word, without raising his voice or lowering it, "You aren't refusing because you're afraid of consequences, Dr. Ashford. You're refusing because you're afraid you'll say yes." Phoebe wanted to fight back, but she couldn't, because it was true. True enough that she felt skinned alive in the shabby kitchen of her own life. She was afraid, not of Kane, not of the Mafia. She was afraid of her own hands. Hands that had mapped 6 surgical steps in her mind the moment she saw the MRI. Hands that tingled with the need to hold a scalpel. Hands that, if she let them decide for her, would have her standing in an operating room before dawn, while everything she was trying to protect collapsed. "Leave my home," Phoebe said, and this time her voice wasn't soft. It was hard and final, the voice of someone protecting herself from her own nature more than from the man in front of her. Kane stood, slowly. He fastened his suit jacket with one hand, a gesture so practiced it was almost unconscious, then walked toward the door. He didn't turn back. He didn't look at her, but as he passed the kitchen table, his hand didn't touch the iPad. It stayed there, the screen still lit. Stella's brain MRI still displayed down to the millimeter. Phoebe saw it and said nothing, and she knew Kane saw that she saw it, and both of them knew it hadn't been forgotten. It had been left, deliberately, precisely, like a final piece set on the board before a man walked away. At the doorway, his back still to Phoebe, Kane said in a low, even voice without turning his head, "I left my number in the iPad. Call me before 6 o'clock in the morning. After that, I start looking for another way. And my other way," he paused for one beat, as if deciding whether to say it, then said it, "usually isn't something anyone wants to know." The door closed. Heavy footsteps on the hallway floor, then on the stairs, fading, shrinking. A car door slammed, engines rumbled, then backed out of the alley and disappeared into the Boston night, as if Kane Mercer and his men had never existed at all. The apartment returned to silence. The refrigerator's buzz. Zoe's steady breathing from the next room. And on the kitchen table, between the stethoscope engraved with Phoebe's name and the lipstick-marked glass, the iPad lay still, the screen still glowing. The MRI image of a 7-year-old child's brain tumor cast a cold blue light up onto the dark ceiling, bleeding into the shadows like an emergency signal no one could shut off. Phoebe stood alone in the kitchen, her right hand still clenched around the kitchen knife. Her left arm hung slack at her side, and her eyes, no matter how hard she tried to look away, no matter how hard she tried to turn her back, no matter how hard she tried to go into the bedroom and lie down beside Zoe and pretend this night had never happened, kept returning to the iPad, to the MRI, to the narrow surgical path as thin as a thread that she'd seen in 30 seconds, to the 7-year-old girl with black hair smiling on a hospital bed, unaware she was waiting to die. Phoebe set the kitchen knife down in the sink, walked into the bedroom, lay down beside Zoe, pulled the blanket up to her chest, and closed her eyes. She told herself to sleep. Tomorrow she'd figure it out. Tomorrow she'd look for a job. Tomorrow she'd call a free legal aid lawyer. Tomorrow she'd forget the iPad on the kitchen table, forget the gray eyes, forget the MRI image, forget the 7-year-old child with black hair smiling on a hospital bed. But her body wouldn't listen. Every time she closed her eyes, the darkness behind her lids wasn't ordinary darkness. It had shape. It had edges. It had a precise size measured in millimeters, and Phoebe realized with a quiet horror that the darkness was the MRI itself. The astrocytoma lodged at the junction of the brainstem and the cerebellum in Stella Mercer burned into her sight like a scorch mark on the retina, even though she'd looked at it for less than 5 minutes. She turned over. Zoe was curled up beside her, arms around a stuffed bear, golden strands spilled across the pillow, breathing soft and steady, the faint scent of children's shampoo lingering in her warm, fine hair. Phoebe listened to her daughter's breathing. That sound that had lulled her to sleep for 6 years through the hardest nights, from 36-hour hospital shifts to nights spent staring at a dark ceiling and doing rent math in her head. But tonight, Zoe's breathing wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to smother the calling inside her. The calling that rose from hands resting at her sides while the fingers refused to relax, twitching and loosening, curling and releasing, as if they were practicing holding a scalpel in a sleep she wouldn't allow herself to take. 12:15, 12:43, 1 in the morning. Phoebe opened her eyes, let out a long breath, then gently eased Zoe's hand off her shirt, got up, and walked back to the kitchen table. The iPad was still there, the screen dark, but the moment her fingertip touched it, it lit up at once, as if it had been waiting for her, as if it knew she'd come back, only a matter of time. The MRI appeared. Phoebe sat down, held the iPad with both hands, and this time she didn't try to fight it. She looked. She looked closely. Her fingers zoomed in on each region, rotated each angle, measured the distance from the surface of the cerebellum to the tumor's margin, assessed vascular involvement, calculated the retrosigmoid approach angle she'd seen in 30 seconds earlier tonight, but hadn't dared to think through to the end. Now, in the hush of 1 in the morning, with no cane, no kitchen knife, no fear, only her and the MRI, Phoebe let her mind do what it did best. She stood, opened the drawer, and searched for a pen. No marker, no proper paper, only an old blue ballpoint pen Zoe used to draw pictures at school, and a stack of thin napkins on the kitchen shelf. Phoebe pulled out one napkin, smoothed it flat on the tabletop, and began to draw. Phase 1, the craniotomy line. Phase 2, the approach angle and the placement for vascular clamps. Phase 3, piecemeal tumor resection with neuromonitoring. Phase 4, managing the portion adherent to the brainstem, the safe boundary measured in 0.5 millimeter. Phase 5, hemostasis and neurologic function checks. Phase 6, skull closure, the postoperative protocol. 6 napkins. 2 in the morning. Phoebe leaned back and stared at the 6 thin napkins spread across the kitchen table, each one a phase of the surgery. Incision lines sketched in blue ink on fragile white paper, and she understood with ruthless clarity that she had just completed the entire operative plan for a case she'd refused 2 hours ago. I said no, she thought, but my hands are saying yes. They won't stop. They know the route to that tumor. They know exactly which millimeter to cut and which second to pause, and they're angry with me because I won't let them do what they were born to do. She looked down at her hands. Small, pale, thin, long, fine fingers, the hands her mentor had once said were made for a scalpel. But Phoebe knew these hands didn't only hold a scalpel. 14 years ago, these same hands, smaller then, weaker then, shakier then, had pressed an old coat to her father's abdominal wound on the hard ground in West Virginia, trying to hold on to a life that was slipping out between her fingers and failing. 9 years ago, these hands had cradled newborn Zoe in a silent recovery room, feeling the small heat of a life she'd carried and delivered alone. And this morning, these hands had carried a box of personal belongings out of the hospital, with no one reaching for her, no one holding on to make her stay. Phoebe closed her eyes, and behind her lids, it wasn't darkness. It was her father's face. Thomas Ashford lay on brown earth, blood soaking through a gray coat, his eyes fading, but still fixed on her, on his 14-year-old daughter crying. And with his last breath, he said, "My girl, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." If there'd been a surgeon there that day, just one single person, with hands good enough and close enough, then Thomas Ashford would have lived. Then Phoebe wouldn't have been orphaned. Then everything would have been different. Phoebe opened her eyes. She looked at the iPad, at Stella's MRI. Then she turned her head toward the bedroom, where Zoe slept, blonde hair spread across the pillow, chest rising and falling, a tiny hand gripping the stuffed bear's ear. 2 children. One was 3 steps away from her, peaceful, safe, waiting for her mother. One was somewhere else in this city, on a hospital bed, black hair spread across a pillow, with a tumor in her head counting down day by day, waiting to die. And between those 2 children, in a dark kitchen at 2 in the morning, Phoebe Ashford sat alone with 6 napkins covered in incision lines, an iPad that wasn't hers, and hands that trembled, not from fear, but because they had known the answer before she dared to admit it. 4:47 in the morning. The sky still wasn't light. Boston remained submerged in that blue-black stretch between night and sunrise, when the city sleeps the deepest and every sound is swallowed by silence. Phoebe sat at the kitchen table with 6 napkins spread in front of her, each one covered in sketched incision lines, the iPad still glowing beside them, and her hands laid flat on the tabletop, palms pressed into the cold wood, as if she were trying to hold them down one last time before letting go. She'd been sitting like that for almost 3 hours, since finishing the 6th napkin, not sleeping, not crying, not moving, only watching 2 things in turn: the MRI on the iPad and Zoe's sleeping shape through the doorway of the next room. 2 children, one breathing steadily behind a wall, one counting down somewhere in the dark city. And between those 2 children, Phoebe finally admitted what her hands had known from the first 30 seconds she saw the MRI, that she was going to operate. She picked up her phone, opened the iPad, found the number Kane had left. Her finger slid across the screen and hit call. The line rang exactly once. Only once. Kane answered on the first second. No sleep in his voice. No bed creak. No pause of a man being dragged awake. And Phoebe understood Kane Mercer hadn't slept tonight either, that he was sitting somewhere in the mansion on Beacon Hill, waiting, the same way she was sitting in an 18-square-meter kitchen in Dorchester, waiting. 2 people on opposite ends of the city. 1 sleepless night. 1 child waiting to die. Dr. Ashford. Kane's voice came through the phone. Low, clear, with not a trace of surprise, as if he'd known she would call, and was only waiting to see when. Phoebe didn't greet him. She didn't explain. She didn't say, "I changed my mind." She didn't say, "I've reconsidered." She didn't offer any opening words a normal person might. She asked 1 question, and only one, her voice small, precise, and heavier than any sentence she'd ever spoken in her life. "If I go into that operating room and I don't come out, who raises Zoe?" Silence. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The longest 3 seconds Phoebe had ever counted. Longer than the 3 seconds she waited for the biopsy result on the first pediatric patient she ever operated on. Longer than the 3 seconds she waited for Zoe's first cry in the delivery room. Longer than the 3 seconds her father stopped breathing on the ground in West Virginia. Then Kane answered. 1 word. Me. No explanation. No promises. Not "I'll take care of it." Not "I'll try." Not anything else. Just 1 word. Short and absolute. His voice neither high nor low. But Phoebe heard in that word what she'd learned to recognize after 15 years, staring down life and death. The sound of a man swearing. Not swearing in court. Not swearing on a Bible. But swearing on the only thing Kane Mercer considered sacred. On his daughter. On Stella. On the only clean thing he'd ever made in this world. Phoebe closed her eyes, drew in a breath, then opened them and spoke in the voice her coworkers at St. Clement used to call her operating room voice. Cold. Exact. With no space for emotion, only space for life and death. "I need a full equipment list in place before 6 o'clock, she said. "The operating suite has to meet ISO Class 5 standards. Real-time neuromonitoring, a Zeiss surgical microscope, intraoperative MRI if you have it, bipolar forceps down to 0.3 millimeters. And your anesthesiologist has to be the best you can find. Not the cheapest, not the easiest to buy. The best, because 1 anesthesia mistake on a 7-year-old with a lesion at the brainstem will kill her before I ever touch a scalpel to skin." She paused, then added, her tone softer but heavier than everything she'd said before. "And you need to understand 1 thing, Mr. Mercer. I'm not doing this for money. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because there's a 7-year-old about to die, and I'm the only person on this planet who can stop it. And I swore when I was 14 that I'd never let anyone die because there weren't hands good enough to save them." Silence on the other end. Then Kane said, still low and steady but with something different in it. Something Phoebe wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Almost respect. "You're the first person who's ever set terms with me that I didn't want to kill." Phoebe didn't laugh. She looked at the 6 napkins on the kitchen table, 6 surgical stages drawn in blue ink on thin paper, and said her last sentence before ending the call. 6 o'clock. Don't be late. The call ended. The kitchen returned to silence. But not the old silence, heavy and trapped. This was the silence before surgery. The kind of silence Phoebe understood better than anyone. When everything has been decided and the body begins preparing on its own. Her hands didn't shake anymore. They rested on the table. Calm, ready, like exactly what they were. The hands of the best pediatric neurosurgeon in this city, The woman the hospital had thrown out into the street that morning, and the woman the entire underground of Boston was waiting for tonight. At 5:30 in the morning, the sky still hadn't fully turned, only a pale gray smear on the eastern horizon over Boston, hinting that dawn was coming but not yet here, when a glossy black SUV stopped in front of the building in Dorchester. Silent, exact, on time down to the minute, the way Kane Mercer ran everything in his empire. Phoebe was ready. She'd gotten up at 5 o'clock, taken a cold shower because the hot water heater flickered like it always did, put on the cleanest clothes she owned, gently woke Zoe, dressed her in the blue hooded coat, and packed the little backpack with a carton of milk, a coloring book, and the stuffed bear. Zoe didn't ask where her mother was going at 5 in the morning. She only looked up with those sleepy blue eyes already reading Phoebe's face, and said in that rough early morning voice, "Mom, who are you going to operate on?" And Phoebe almost broke down because her 6-year-old didn't ask where they were going. She asked who her mother was going to operate on, because in Zoe's world, her mother didn't go to work. Her mother went to save someone, and today was no different. Renner drove. Phoebe sat in the back seat with Zoe, the little girl dozing on her mother's shoulder for the 20 minutes they moved through Boston streets empty in the early fog. The SUV stopped in front of a 3-story building in South Boston that looked like an old warehouse from the outside. Gray brick, a roll-up steel door, no sign, no visible cameras, nothing that suggested there was anything inside but dusty crates. But when Renner swiped a keycard and the steel door slid aside, Phoebe stepped in and stopped cold. The basement had been converted into a complete operating suite. Not the rough, makeshift room she'd imagined when she heard the word Mafia, but an operating room built to a standard beyond anything she'd ever seen at St. Clement. Shadowless LED surgical lights overhead. The newest neuronavigation system, a compact intraoperative MRI, one of only 2 in all of Boston. A brand new Zeiss surgical microscope still sealed. A specialized neurosurgical table with a Mayfield head fixation system. Along the wall, glass cabinets filled with microsurgical instruments arranged by size from smallest to largest, including the 0.3mm bipolar set she'd demanded on the phone less than an hour earlier. Phoebe turned and looked at Kane standing behind her. He still wore a black suit. He still had that piercing gaze, but under the cold white LED lights of the operating room, his face looked more exhausted than it had the night before, and Phoebe realized he truly hadn't slept. Kane watched her, reading the shock on her face, and said in his low, even voice, "I built this room 3 months ago, when the 9th doctor refused. I bought every piece of equipment money can buy. Neuronavigation from Germany, Zeiss optics from Switzerland, a compact MRI from Japan. I hired an architect to design an ISO Class 5 suite. I have everything. I was only missing the hands. And now the hands are here." Phoebe didn't answer. She walked to the instrument cabinet, opened it, and checked each drawer with the eyes and fingertips of a surgeon stepping into battle. Then nodded. A small nod, but enough for Kane to understand she approved. The anesthesiologist was already there. Dr. Ellis, 50 years old. Gray hair, steady hands, calm eyes. Once chief of anesthesia at Massachusetts General before retiring early, and Phoebe recognized immediately that Kane hadn't hired the cheapest man or the easiest man to buy. He'd hired the best, exactly as she'd required. Then the door to the next room opened, and Phoebe saw the little girl, Stella Mercer, 7 years old, sitting on a hospital bed with her legs swinging, long black hair thinned by chemotherapy but still tied neatly with a pale pink bow, skin washed pale beneath the lights, but her big dark eyes bright and focused as she drew with crayons on a white sheet of paper resting on her lap. Phoebe stepped closer and knelt to bring herself level with the child's eyes, and Stella looked up. The girl studied Phoebe from head to toe, tilted her head, and said in that clear voice only a 7-year-old could have, "You're prettier than the other doctors. Those people all looked sad when they looked at me. But you don't." Phoebe smiled, and it wasn't a polite smile. It was the smile of a mother seeing her own child in the child in front of her, because Stella's smile was like Zoe's, trusting the world completely, even while the world was betraying them. "And you're better too," Phoebe said. "Gentle but certain, I promise." Just then, Zoe appeared behind her mother, fully awake now, backpack on her shoulders, blue eyes sweeping across the room until they landed on Stella. The 2 children looked at each other. 2 seconds of silence, the kind children use to measure each other faster than any adult can. Then Zoe stepped forward, held out her hand, and said with a confidence Phoebe knew her daughter had learned from watching her, "I'm Zoe. My mom's going to operate on you. Don't worry." Stella stared at Zoe's hand, then at Zoe's face, and asked in a quieter voice, "Does your mom ever get scared?" Zoe thought for a moment, tilted her head in the exact way Phoebe did when she was thinking, then answered, "Yeah, my mom gets scared too, but after she's scared, she still does it. That's the difference." Stella smiled, the same wide smile from the photo on Kane's phone the night before. Then the two girls sat side by side on the hospital bed, Zoe picking up crayons and drawing with Stella as if they'd known each other in another life, and Phoebe stood watching her daughter steady the daughter of a Mafia boss, her chest tightening with pride and pain at the same time. In the corner, Renner stood as still as stone, face set, eyes scanning the room out of habit, but then his hand quietly pulled a small juice box from his coat pocket. He walked over to Zoe, set it down beside her without a word, and returned to his post. Zoe looked at the juice, looked up at Renner, then said, "Thank you, sir," in the most polite voice she had, and for a brief moment, Renner's stone face softened. Only a flicker, so fast almost no one would notice. But Phoebe noticed, because she'd been trained to read the smallest shifts in a human face. Kane stood across the room with his back against the wall, arms folded, his steel-colored eyes fixed on Phoebe kneeling at his daughter's level, on Zoe coloring beside Stella, on his child smiling for the first time in weeks, and in those cold gray eyes, for the first time since Phoebe met him the night before, she saw something she almost didn't believe she was seeing: hope. Kane arranged for Phoebe and Zoe to stay in a secure apartment on the floor, directly above the building that housed the operating suite. 2 clean bedrooms, beds made with white sheets, a refrigerator packed with food, everything so new it looked like it had been purchased that morning. And maybe it had, because Kane Mercer was the kind of man who, once he decided something, the world around him had to reshape itself within hours. Zoe fell asleep at 9 o'clock, curled up on the unfamiliar bed but still holding her familiar stuffed bear. Blonde hair spread across the white pillow, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, peaceful enough that Phoebe stood there watching her for a few more minutes before gently closing the door. The surgery was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the morning, 8 hours away. Phoebe knew she should sleep. Her body needed rest. Her hands needed steadiness. Her eyes needed sharpness. But her mind wouldn't shut off. She stepped out onto the small back balcony, which overlooked a narrow cement yard below, and the Boston night covered everything in a darkness softened by the distant, faint orange glow of streetlights. The air was cool, a thin salt scent drifting in from the South Boston harbor, and Phoebe leaned on the railing and breathed in deep, trying to force her lungs to loosen even as her chest tightened around everything that would happen when the sun rose. Then she looked down into the yard and saw Kane. He stood alone down there. No bodyguards, no phone, no black suit, only a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his back against the brick wall, his eyes lifted to the sky in a way that made Phoebe unsure whether he was searching for stars or staring into emptiness. Under the night sky, he looked smaller, much smaller than the man who'd stepped into her kitchen less than a day earlier, with cold gray eyes and a voice that made grown men swallow. Under the weak orange light, without the suit, without the power, Kane Mercer was simply a father standing alone in the night before his daughter went onto an operating table. Phoebe didn't know whether she spoke first or he looked up first, but their eyes met across the distance of one floor, and without either of them asking, they began to talk. Quiet, soft, voices barely carrying through the stillness of 11 o'clock at night, not about the surgery, not about equipment or odds or cranial nerve risk, not about money or the Mafia or St. Clement, but about the thing both of them had been thinking all day, and neither had dared to say out loud. Kane asked, his voice lower than usual, almost a whisper, "What are you most afraid of?" Phoebe looked down at her hands on the railing, the hands that would open a 7-year-old skull in the morning, and she answered without thinking, because the truth had lived in her for so long she didn't know when it moved in. "Zoe growing up with no one, like me. That's what I'm most afraid of. More than failing in the operating room, more than losing my license, more than anything." Silence below, long. Then Kane said, his voice small, unlike anything she'd heard from him before. Not the voice of a man who ordered, not the voice of a man who negotiated, but the voice of a man saying something he'd never said to anyone. "I'm afraid Stella will grow up and learn who her father really is. Learn what I've done, the people I've hurt, the world I built with my hands." And he stopped. swallowing hard, and still love me. That's the scariest part, because I don't deserve to be loved by something as clean as Stella. Do you understand? Being forgiven by someone who doesn't know what they're forgiving isn't forgiveness. It's innocence. And that innocence will disappear the day Stella understands who her father is. Phoebe listened, and for the first time since meeting Kane Mercer, she didn't see a Mafia boss. She didn't see the black suit, the cold gray eyes, the guards, the glossy black SUV. She saw a father slowly dying of fear of losing his child. Not losing her to the tumor, but losing her to the truth, like her. Two people standing in two different worlds. She, an orphaned surgeon, with $847. He, a kingpin with an underground empire across South Boston. And yet tonight, from balcony to yard, they were so alike Phoebe felt something tighten in her chest that she couldn't name. She said softly, "You deserve more than you think. At least you're here. At least tonight you're standing down there losing sleep over your daughter instead of sitting in some office counting money. And there are fathers who are present everywhere except the one place their children need them. You're not that kind of man." Kane lifted his gaze to her. And for the first time, under the faint orange streetlight of the Boston night, his gray eyes weren't cold anymore. 6:30 in the morning, 30 minutes before the operation. Phoebe stood in the prep room, already changed into green scrubs, blonde hair tucked neatly under a surgical cap, washing her hands beneath warm water in the same 7-step protocol she'd performed thousands of times, when her phone vibrated on the shelf behind her. She wasn't going to look, but her eyes flicked to the screen by accident, and she saw the name, Bradley Whitman. Her heart stabbed once, not from fear, but from anger, the kind of anger she'd forced down into the bottom of her stomach since yesterday morning, and now it rose up into her throat the moment she saw the name of the man who had framed her. The text was short, tight, cold, exactly the way Bradley spoke, every word chosen to cut as deeply as possible with the fewest syllables. "I know what you're doing, Dr. Ashford. If you dare touch a scalpel while your license is suspended, your license will be revoked permanently. Permanently. I'll personally make sure of it." Phoebe read it, stared at it for 3 seconds, then flipped her phone face down on the shelf and kept washing. Warm water ran over each finger, carrying the soap away, and she watched her hands under the stream, the hands Bradley Whitman wanted to strip of their purpose forever, the hands that couldn't save her father 14 years ago, the hands that had drawn 6 surgical stages on napkins last night, and she wondered if this was the last time she would ever scrub in. If Bradley meant what he said, if he had enough power and enough hatred to bury her, then the surgery today would be the final surgery of Phoebe Ashford's life. She stepped into the hallway leading to the operating room and looked through the observation glass. Stella lay on the table, small and pale, black hair shaved clean at the back of her head, and Dr. Ellis was preparing anesthesia. The child's eyes were closed, not because the medication had taken hold, but because she was afraid. Phoebe could tell from the way Stella's tiny fingers gripped the edge of the sheet, tightening and releasing, in a steady rhythm, the same way Phoebe's own fingers had curled and uncured last night, while she fought herself not to open the iPad. Then Stella opened her eyes, looked around the cold operating room crowded with equipment, and moisture gathered in the corners. Dr. Ellis took her hand, said something gentle, and the anesthesia began to flow through the IV line. The big dark eyes drifted shut. The fingers loosened their hold on the sheet, and Stella Mercer slipped into a sleep she didn't know she would wake from. Phoebe swallowed hard. She turned and looked through the other side of the glass, where Kane stood in the viewing room. He wore a black shirt, arms folded across his chest, back straight, face hard as stone. Not a crease of expression, not a wasted motion. Exactly the Kane Mercer the world knew. Cold, controlled, untouchable. But his gray eyes were locked on his daughter on that table. And in those eyes, Phoebe read what she'd read in every kind of person behind an observation window over the course of her career. A plea. Not a plea spoken aloud. Kane Mercer didn't plead with words. But those eyes, the same eyes that had warmed for the first time on the balcony last night, were saying it more clearly than any sentence he'd ever given her. "Please, save my child." Phoebe glanced down the hall to the small waiting area at the end, its glass door transparent, and saw Zoe sitting on a plastic chair with her feet swinging above the floor, bent over a drawing with the crayons Stella had lent her yesterday. Renner stood nearby, arms crossed, face set, but he'd pulled the chair closer to Zoe by more than a foot from where it had been at first. A small gesture Phoebe noticed, a small warmth in her chest against the chill of the operating floor. Zoe was drawing two little girls holding hands beneath a yellow sun, and Phoebe knew that picture was meant for Stella when she woke up. If she woke up, Phoebe turned back to the operating room door. Inside, the shadowless LED lights poured down onto the table, creating a circle of pure white brightness in the middle of the room, and Stella lay within that light, tiny, fragile, like a child held in the arms of brightness waiting for someone to step in. Phoebe thought of Bradley's message. Permanently, if she walked through that door, Bradley would keep his word. He would use every ounce of power, every connection, every shard of hatred to make sure she never held a scalpel again. She would lose her career, lose her identity, lose everything she had built out of the ashes of her humble, painful beginnings. But if she didn't walk through that door, Stella Mercer would die. 7 years old, black hair, a pink bow, a drawing of two people under a yellow sun. She would die. Phoebe pulled on her sterile gloves, lifted her mask, and placed her hand on the operating room door. She took one deep breath, the last breath before stepping into a place where fear had no room, where Bradley had no room, where $847 had no room, where there was only her hands, and a child. She pushed the door open, stepped into the circle of light, and said in a voice the entire room could hear, calm, clear, unshaking, "This is what I was born to do." The scalpel touched Stella Mercer's scalp, and the world outside the operating room stopped existing. No more Bradley Whitman, no more threatening messages, no more financial ruin, no more suspended license. Nothing left but the pure white LED light pouring down onto the small skull of a 7-year-old child, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the sound of breathing through surgical masks, and Phoebe Ashford's hands. Phase 1. Craniotomy. Opening the skull, Phoebe made the retrozygmoid incision behind Stella's right ear, precise to the millimeter, the blade moving smooth and decisive, not a second of hesitation, not a single unnecessary line. The scrub nurse passed the cranial drill. Phoebe took it, and the drill's whine rose in the silent operating room, cutting through the skull of a 7-year-old with a precision that made the entire team hold their breath as they watched. Her hands didn't shake, not by a single millimeter, and while her fingers guided the drill with the absolute steadiness her colleagues at St. Clement had once called supernatural, behind her mask, behind eyes locked on Stella's bone with total focus, another image lay over everything in her mind. Faint but never gone. 14 years ago. Brown earth, warm blood soaking through a coat, 14-year-old hands trembling as they pressed down on her father's abdominal wound, trying to hold a life that was slipping away through the spaces between her fingers. Those hands had failed, but today's hands weren't 14-year-old hands. Today's hands had 15 years of training, hundreds of operations, thousands of practice hours, and an oath she kept with everything she had. The bone flap was lifted away. The dura appeared, thin and white, pulsing softly with each beat, protecting the small brain beneath. Phoebe opened the dura with microsurgical scissors, unsealing the last door into the world inside Stella's skull, where life and death were separated by a millimeter. Phase 2. Approaching the tumor. Phoebe bent to the Zeiss operating microscope, and the world narrowed to a single bright circle in the eyepiece, where Stella's brain tissue appeared at 20 times magnification, tiny vessels like red threads running across a pink-gray field. She began to separate tissue along the approach she'd drawn on napkins the night before. Step by step, gentle and patient, the way someone feels their way through a maze where one wrong move means there's no way back. But as she went deeper, past the cerebellum, toward the brainstem junction, what she saw in the microscope made her stop for half a second. The tumor was larger than the MRI. Not only larger, it had invaded the surrounding vessels, clinging to the wall of the anterior-inferior cerebellar artery like tree roots gripping rock, and Phoebe understood immediately that her 6-napkin plan had to change, that this operation had just shifted from brutally hard to almost impossible. She adjusted. In her mind, the 6 surgical phases rearranged themselves in seconds. A new approach path, a new cutting angle, a new order for vascular control. All of it happening fast and automatic as breathing, because this was what Phoebe Ashford's brain had been born to do. She kept dissecting, deeper, closer to the mass, and everything was going perfectly until it wasn't. Blood. Sudden. A lot. A small vessel branch the MRI hadn't revealed because the tumor had obscured it tore, as Phoebe separated the tissue around it, and bright red blood flooded the field, coating the microscope view, turning the bright circle in the Zeiss into a glaring red screen. The team reacted at once, but Phoebe heard it in their voices, the panic. The scrub nurse sucked in a sharp breath behind her mask. The assisting surgeon spoke faster than normal. Ruptured vessel, heavy bleeding, SpO2 is dropping. From the head of the table, Dr. Ellis announced in a tight but professional voice, oxygen saturation, 92%, and falling, 91, 90. Every second the saturation fell was a second Stella's brain went without oxygen. Every second without oxygen meant neurons dying, and neurons, once dead, never came back. But Phoebe didn't panic. She'd seen blood before. She'd watched her father's blood soak through a coat into West Virginia dirt. And that day she'd had nothing in her hands but an old jacket and a prayer. Today she had everything. She spoke, her voice so calm the entire room went silent instantly. Suction clear. Bipolar point, 3 mm. I see it. The nurse passed the bipolar, a tiny cautery instrument with a tip measuring point 3 mm, smaller than the tip of a ballpoint pen, and Phoebe brought it into the blood-filled field, through the microscope now nearly cleared by suction, found the exact rupture point, and began to control the bleeding. 1 second, 2 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds. The blood still seeped, 30 seconds. SpO 288, 40 seconds. Phoebe's fingers didn't tremble, even as a clock counted down inside her head, because she knew that if she didn't stop the bleeding within 90 seconds, Stella's brain would begin irreversible injury. 50 seconds. 60 seconds, Dr. Ellis reported. SpO 286. 70 seconds. 80 seconds. Phoebe stared through the microscope, the bipolar tip moving slow and exact, hunting the last bleeding point in soaked tissue, and she whispered, almost more to herself than to anyone in the room, I've got you now. 87 seconds. Cauterize. 89 seconds. The bleeding stopped. 90 seconds. The SpO2 stopped falling at 85, then began to climb back up. 86, 87, 89, 90. The operating room exhaled at the same time, a collective breath nobody had to cue, and Phoebe straightened on the surgeon's stool, closed her eyes for a single second, only 1 second, then opened them and said, continue, 90 seconds. That was the distance between life and death. Between a 7-year-old waking up calling for her dad and a father losing the only clean thing left in his life. 90 seconds that Phoebe Ashford's hands had held back. Stage 3. Tumor resection. This was the point where the operation stopped being only surgery and became art. And Phoebe Ashford was the only artist on this planet who could paint a canvas no one else dared to touch. The astrocytoma lay in front of her beneath the surgical microscope. Pale gray, rough-surfaced, rooted deep into brain tissue like an invader that had settled into occupied land, and Phoebe knew she couldn't pull it out in one motion, couldn't make a single clean cut and lift it away, because doing that would drag healthy vessels and healthy nerve tissue with it, would kill Stella faster than the tumor ever could. She had to take it in pieces, piecemeal, one small fragment at a time, patient and exact, like removing bricks from a wall without letting the house collapse. She took the first piece, tiny, only a few millimeters, then stopped. 5 seconds, listening. The neuromonitoring ran its steady tone, signals stable, no sign of damage. She took the second piece, stopped. 5 seconds, listening, still stable. The third piece, stopped. 5 seconds, listening. A slight change in the signal. She adjusted her angle, backed away 0.5 millimeter, took it again, stopped. 5 seconds, listening. The signal settled back to normal. Over and over, cut and pause, each time 5 seconds of silence to listen to Stella's brain the way you listen to the breathing of a sleeping child, and the assisting surgeon beside her, watching through the secondary scope, murmured to the nurse in a voice of awe he didn't bother to hide, she isn't operating, she's talking to the tumor. She's asking it a question before every cut, and the tumor is answering. Outside the operating room, behind the observation glass, Kane Mercer stood motionless as stone for more than 2 hours. He didn't sit, even though there was a chair. He didn't drink water, even though Renner had placed a bottle beside him. He didn't look at his phone, even though it kept vibrating in his pocket. He only stood there, arms hanging at his sides, gray eyes fixed on the glass, watching Phoebe's small hands moving inside his daughter's skull. And for the first time in his life, Kane Mercer faced something money couldn't buy. Power couldn't control. Violence couldn't threaten. He had used money to build an operating room. Power to find Phoebe. The fear of an entire city to get everything he wanted. But in that room, on the other side of the glass, where his daughter lay with her skull open and the tumor being lifted away one piece at a time, he controlled nothing. He was only a father. Helpless. Watching. And that helplessness, the thing Kane Mercer hated more than anything in the world, was now the only thing he had. Stage 4. The final portion. The hardest portion. The portion 11 doctors had stared at and then walked away from. The tumor was down to one last piece. Tiny. Only a few millimeters. But it was attached directly to the brainstem. The place that governed breathing, heart rate, the most basic life functions of the human body. Half a millimeter wrong, and Stella would stop breathing. Not stop for a moment. Stop forever. Phoebe stared through the microscope and saw it. The last fragment, sitting on the border between life and death, tethered to the brainstem by tissue so thin she couldn't be sure she was seeing tumor or healthy nerve, because under 20 times magnification, the line between them was as blurred as a horizon in fog. She began to cut, slower than she'd moved at any point in the case. The neuromonitoring continued, but here, in this location, signals weren't fast enough, weren't precise enough, because the brainstem reacted in thousandths of a second, and machines couldn't keep up. The oxygen saturation began to fall. 95. 93. Dr. Ellis called it out, voice tight. Saturation is dropping. 92. You're too close to the brainstem. The neuromonitoring chirped an abnormal pattern, the beeps shifting rhythm, and everyone in the room knew what that meant. The assisting surgeon spoke quickly. You should stop. If you continue, you'll injure the respiratory center. But Phoebe knew that if she stopped, the remaining fragment would grow back in a few months, larger, more aggressive, and next time no one would be able to operate. Stella would die slowly instead of quickly. No, she didn't stop. She did something no surgeon was taught in medical school. Something no textbook ever described. Something only hands that felt like they'd been touched by grace would dare to do. She closed her eyes. In the operating room, in the middle of a neurosurgery, she closed her eyes. 3 seconds. The entire room held its breath. Dr. Ellis looked up from the monitors. The assisting surgeon froze. The scrub nurse tightened her grip on the metal tray. But Phoebe didn't need to see. She needed to feel. Her fingers rested on the microsurgical instrument, the tip touching the boundary between tumor and brainstem, and through touch, through the sensitivity of fingers trained over thousands of hours, she felt what the microscope couldn't show. The smallest difference between firm tumor tissue and softer living nerve, a border the eye couldn't find but the hand could. She opened her eyes and said with absolute calm, I can see the line. The next 7 minutes were the longest 7 minutes of everyone's life in that room. Phoebe cut in tiny, almost invisible fragments, paused, listened, felt, cut again, paused, listened, felt, each piece falling away into the steel tray beside her, and each faint click as it landed was one step closer to life. The oxygen saturation wavered. 92, 90, 91. Up and down like the breathing of someone crossing a tightrope between two tall buildings. Each step possibly the last. Then the final fragment released. Phoebe lifted it with microsurgical forceps, so small it was no bigger than a sesame seed, but a sesame seed that had nearly killed a 7-year-old child, and she placed it into the steel tray with the gentleness you reserved for something you'd just taken from death's hand. The oxygen saturation rose. 93, 95, 97. Neuromonitoring returned to normal, Dr. Ellis announced, his voice trembling slightly with relief. Vitals are stable. Everything is stable. Phoebe straightened, looked through the microscope one last time, the field clean. No tumor tissue remaining, only healthy brain. Pale pink, pulsing faintly with the rhythm of blood flow. Alive. She said the 2 words everyone in that operating room had been waiting more than 4 hours to hear. Close. We're done. The team began to close the skull. Phoebe rose from the surgical chair, pulled off her gloves, removed her mask, stepped out of the circle of LED light. She went through the operating room door into the empty hall and leaned her back against the cold wall. Her knees buckled, not from fatigue, from something larger than fatigue, larger than relief, larger than victory. Something she'd carried in her chest for 14 years, since the day her 14-year-old hands couldn't save her father on the ground in West Virginia. A promise. I will never let anyone die because there aren't hands good enough. Today, 14 years later, those hands had kept that promise, and Phoebe Ashford slid down onto the cold hallway floor, back against the wall, head bowed, and she cried. Soundless. The kind of crying that belongs to someone who has been strong for too long and is finally allowed to be weak, even if only for a few seconds, even if only alone, even if no one sees. Stella still hadn't woken. 2 hours after the surgery, she lay in the recovery bed, her head wrapped in white gauze, her face pale under the lights, her eyes shut tight, her chest rising gently with the rhythm of assisted ventilation, and Phoebe sat beside her, unable to pull her gaze from the vital signs monitor. SpO2, 97. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure stable. Green numbers blinked steadily on a black screen, and each number was a promise that Stella Mercer was still alive, that Phoebe's hands had done the right thing, that 4 hours in the operating room hadn't been meaningless. But Phoebe still couldn't fully breathe. She knew that after brain surgery, everything could change in seconds. Swelling, secondary bleeding, seizures, any complication could appear without warning, and she wouldn't let herself leave this chair until Stella opened her eyes. She'd changed into clean scrubs, washed her face, drank a cup of water a nurse handed her, but her hands still trembled slightly, not from fatigue but from 4 hours of adrenaline draining out of her body, leaving behind that strange emptiness only people who've stood on the border between life and death can understand. The recovery room door eased open. Phoebe didn't need to turn to know who it was, because she heard the footsteps, heavy and sure, but slower than usual, much slower than the steps of the man who'd knocked on her apartment door last night, as if the weight of the hours spent behind glass watching his daughter on an operating table had pressed down on every stride. Kane walked to Stella's bedside and stopped on the opposite side from Phoebe, and he looked at his daughter. He didn't say a word. He just looked, at Stella's chest rising and falling, at her closed eyes, at the black hair that had been shaved in part at the back of her head, at the white bandage wrapped around her skull, at the tiny hand lying still on the white sheet, the hand that only hours ago had been holding crayons and drawing with Zoe, and now lay there, soft, quiet, waiting to wake. Kane stood for a long time, silent, and Phoebe, who'd read thousands of faces in her career, looked at Kane Mercer's face and saw something she'd never seen in him before. Fracture. Not loud or dramatic fracture, quiet fracture. The kind that comes from holding everything inside for too long. And now, with the worst danger past, the wall beginning to crack. Then Kane did something Phoebe never thought she'd witness. He bowed his head. The Mafia boss of South Boston. The man the whole city feared. The man whose guards swallowed hard when they heard him give an order. Bowed his head to a 29-year-old surgeon, a woman with nothing to her name but her integrity. He bowed low, and he said in a voice Phoebe could hear splitting open from the inside, "I owe you a life, Dr. Ashford, and I don't know how to repay a debt like that because I've never owed anyone something money can't buy." Phoebe looked at Kane. At the crown of his lowered head, the black hair slicked back, now slightly loosened from hours behind the glass with no thought to smoothing it again. And she said softly, not in an operating room voice anymore, but in the voice of a mother, a woman, someone who'd lost, and someone who'd been saved. "I didn't save Stella because you owe me, Mr. Mercer. I saved her because it was right, because I was once the child nobody saved. My father died because there was no one good enough and close enough, and I swore I wouldn't let that happen to any other child, Stella or anyone else." Kane lifted his head. His gray eyes were wet, not spilling over, but wet. And Phoebe saw it, and she didn't say anything more, because there are moments when silence is the only language large enough to hold everything happening between two people. Then the recovery room door burst open, and a small yellow storm rushed in. Zoe ran across the room in star-covered sneakers, blonde hair flying back, blue eyes blazing, and she flung herself straight into her mother's arms. "Mom," Zoe said, breathless from running. "You're done with the surgery, right? You're so good. I told you. You're better than Wonder Woman." Phoebe held her daughter, held her tight, her nose buried in blonde hair that smelled like crayons and apple juice, and she felt something in her chest finally let go, something she'd been gripping since yesterday morning when Linda Voss had slid the termination notice across the desk. Renner stood at the doorway, his back against the frame, his face still hard but his eyes on Zoe with something Phoebe had recognized, the moment he'd handed her daughter a juice box this morning. Something soft that Renner's profession didn't allow him to show, but somehow Zoe had pulled it out anyway. Then that sound came. Small, hoarse, weak, but so clear the entire room went still. "Dad." Everyone turned toward the bed. Stella opened her eyes, big dark eyes blinking under the lights, hazy, not sharp yet, but searching. And when they found Kane standing at the bedside, her dry, cracked lips curved into a faint smile that was still so bright, Phoebe had to turn her face away because she knew if she looked 1 second longer, she'd cry for the second time that day. "Dad," Stella said again, quieter now, rougher now, but every word distinct. "I'm hungry." 2 words. "I'm hungry." The most ordinary 2 words in the world. 2 words every 7-year-old says every day and nobody notices. But in this recovery room, after 4 hours of surgery, after 90 seconds of bleeding control, after half a millimeter between life and death, those 2 words rang out like a bell. Kane Mercer turned his face away. He turned his whole body toward the wall. His shoulders shook. Not much. Just once. But Phoebe saw it. And she knew. The man all of South Boston feared. The man who said he'd burn the whole city down. Was crying. Crying with his face to the wall. Because he didn't know how to cry in front of anyone. Because in his world, tears were a luxury a Mafia boss wasn't allowed to have. But his daughter had just opened her eyes and said she was hungry. And that was bigger than every rule he'd ever made for himself. Zoe looked at Stella, then at Kane facing the wall, then back at Stella, and with the instinct of a 6-year-old who understands faster than adults, she slid out of her mother's lap, ran to Stella's bedside, pulled a lollipop from her coat pocket that Renner had given her this morning, and held it out in front of Stella. "Eat this for now," Zoe said, serious as if she were writing a prescription. "My mom says after surgery you've got to eat light, and a lollipop is the lightest thing ever." Stella looked at the candy, then at Zoe, then smiled, wider now, brighter now, and her tiny hand reached for it, her fingers still so weak Zoe had to help hold it. Then Stella held Zoe's hand, and Zoe held back. 2 small hands, one white and one white, the daughter of an orphan doctor from the coal country of West Virginia, and the daughter of the Mafia boss of South Boston, holding onto each other on a hospital's white sheet, and neither child knew what the world outside thought of their parents. Neither child cared, because at their age, the world was simply lollipops, crayons, and a friend's hand. 3 days after the surgery, Stella Mercer was able to sit up in bed, eat rice porridge with a plastic spoon, and start drawing again, this time sketching a blonde woman in blue, standing beside a huge star, and she told Zoe that the woman was the pretty doctor, and the star was because she was the best in the universe. Phoebe checked on Stella every 4 hours, tested reflexes, vision, movement, cognition, and each time the results were better than the last, she let out another small breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But that relief didn't last. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Renner knocked on Phoebe's door, his stone face as expressionless as ever, and placed a small black USB drive on the table. "My boss told me to give you this," Renner said. Inside is the St. Clement Hospital hallway footage from the night Bradley altered the chart, the system logs showing the exact edit time, and the messages between Bradley Whitman and Linda Voss about how to pin it on you. It's all there, clear enough to bury both of them. Phoebe picked up the USB, small, light, but heavier than anything she'd ever held, because inside it was the one thing she'd wanted from the moment she was pushed out of the hospital. Proof, truth, justice. She held it for 30 seconds, felt its weight, imagined the moment she placed it on the table in front of the medical board, and watched Bradley Whitman crumble, imagined Linda Voss's face when the footage showed she'd known the truth from the start, and still fired Phoebe. Those 30 seconds were sweet. Then she set the USB down on the table, gently but firmly, the way you set a scalpel onto a tray after a case, and said to Renner in a voice calm but unshakable, "Thank you, but I can't use this. I can't build justice on illegal evidence. Because if I do, I'm no different from Bradley. I would be someone choosing a shortcut for the sake of an outcome instead of doing what's right. And if I become that kind of person, then everything I've taught Zoe becomes a lie." Renner looked at her, didn't comment, picked up the USB, slipped it back into his pocket, and walked out. Phoebe began searching for another path on her own. She called St. Clement's IT department and requested an audit of Owen's patient record for the night before the surgery. But the call was transferred through 3 people and then vanished into silence, and when she called again, The operator told her the request had been denied by a direct order from the chief administrative officer, Linda Voss. She called the Massachusetts Medical Board and explained what had happened, but the intake worker said her license was suspended, so she didn't have legal standing to file a complaint, and that she should worry about herself before she worried about anyone else. The voice cold and bureaucratic, the voice the system used for people without power. Failure. Every door closed. Linda blocked her from the inside. The board blocked her from the outside. Bradley sat in the hospital, safe behind the wall his father had built with decades of reputation and influence. That night, Phoebe lay in bed in the secure apartment, Zoe asleep beside her, and the USB she'd handed back to Renner kept flashing in her mind the way the MRI had haunted her the night before surgery. She knew what was on it. She knew the precise contents, because Renner had described them in detail. Hallway footage showing Bradley entering the server room at 11:43 at night. System logs showing Owen's anesthesia record edited at 11:51. Messages between Bradley and Linda at 6 o'clock the next morning discussing how to summon Phoebe into the disciplinary meeting. She couldn't use that evidence, but she could use the information. And the difference between the two, Phoebe realized at 3 in the morning when she jolted upright in bed with bright eyes, was the difference between submitting illegal evidence in a hearing and guiding an independent investigative reporter to know exactly where to look. The next morning, Phoebe contacted Marcus Webb, an investigative reporter at the Boston Globe who covered healthcare, a man she'd met at a medical conference 2 years earlier. She didn't hand over the USB. She didn't give him any illegally obtained evidence. She only told Marcus that if he requested St. Clement's audit logs for the night before Owen's surgery, under the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, he would find something very interesting, and that if he reviewed the third-floor surgical corridor cameras between 11 o'clock and midnight that night, he'd understand why Dr. Phoebe Ashford had been fired. Marcus listened, took notes, and began investigating. But Bradley Whitman wasn't the kind of man who sat still and waited to die. Somehow, maybe through Warren Whitman's connections on the medical board, Bradley learned someone was digging, and he struck back. Fast, ruthless, precise. 2 days later, a story appeared at the same time on the front health pages of 3 Boston newspapers, with nearly identical headlines. Fired doctor for medical error performs illegal brain surgery for organized crime. The piece included Phoebe's photo, her full name, details of her suspended license, an anonymous source inside St. Clement, confirming that Dr. Ashford had been fired for endangering a child, and then had practiced illegally for a figure tied to organized crime. Phoebe read the article on her phone, sitting at the kitchen table, and it felt exactly like that morning at St. Clement, when Linda slid the termination notice across the desk, the world shaking under her feet, but she didn't fall, because she'd learned how to stand on ground that moved. The medical board called that afternoon to inform her that in addition to the current temporary suspension, they were considering revoking her license permanently based on allegations of illegal practice. Permanently. The word showed up again, the same word from Bradley's text, and this time it was heavier, because it wasn't coming from an enemy. It was coming from the system, from the very institution Phoebe had trusted her whole career to protect people who did the right thing. That night, Phoebe sat on the sofa with her phone face down on her lap, staring out the window without seeing anything, and Zoe climbed up beside her, not asking what had happened because she'd looked at her mother's face and knew the storm had returned. But Zoe asked a different question, her voice small, calm, and simple in the way only a child could be. "Mom, is Stella going to die?" Phoebe looked at her daughter. "No, sweetheart. Stella is going to be okay." Zoe nodded, stayed quiet for a moment, then said in a voice as firm as a math fact no one could argue with, "Then you're a good doctor. People can say whatever they want. Stella living means you're good, right?" Phoebe pulled her daughter into her arms and didn't speak, because there was nothing she could say that would be better than what her 6-year-old had just said. 2 weeks after the article, the official hearing of the Massachusetts Medical Board was convened in the large conference room on the 4th floor of the board's headquarters, a space paneled in dark oak with a high ceiling and pale golden light spilling from classic hanging chandeliers, a room every doctor in Boston knew as the courtroom of a career, the place where a license is granted or stripped away, where a lifetime of striving can end with a gavel striking wood. Phoebe sat on the left side, wearing a white blouse, blonde hair tied back neatly, spine straight, hands resting on her lap, calm in the way only someone who's spent 4 hours in an operating room with a child's skull open in front of her can be calm, because after that, Every meeting room in the world feels small. Bradley Whitman sat on the right, gray suit, dark blue tie, his face carefully arranged into the seriousness and sorrow Phoebe had seen in the discipline office at St. Clement, the same expression, the same mask, and beside him a private attorney Phoebe could guess someone else was paying for. Linda Voss sat in the row behind Bradley, back straight, face cold, eyes sweeping over Phoebe once and then sliding away as if Phoebe didn't exist. 5 board members sat up front, and the hearing began. For the first 30 minutes, everything unfolded exactly according to the script Bradley had prepared. His attorney argued that Dr. Ashford had been terminated for severe medical error based on the hospital's system records, that she had then practiced medicine illegally for a criminal organization, and that her license should be permanently revoked to protect patient safety. Bradley nodded at the right moments, frowned at the right moments, performed the grief of a colleague forced to accuse a colleague so flawlessly. Phoebe almost wanted to applaud. Then Marcus Webb, a Boston Globe reporter, was called as a witness. He carried a thick stack of documents, and when he began to speak, the air in the room changed. Marcus explained that after receiving information from an anonymous source, he had filed a FOIA request with St. Clement to obtain the audit log for the electronic medical record system, and when the hospital refused, he sued, and the court ordered the hospital to produce the records within 7 days. The audit log showed clearly, precisely, beyond denial, that the anesthesia medication record for the pediatric patient Owen had been edited at 11:51 the night before surgery from the login account of Dr. Bradley Whitman. Marcus continued that he had also requested the third-floor corridor security footage for the surgical suite, and the camera captured Bradley Whitman entering the server room at 11:43 and leaving at 11:55, matching exactly the time of the record edits shown in the audit log. All of it was lawful evidence, obtained through legal channels, approved by the court. The room fell silent. The 5 board members looked at one another. Bradley Whitman sat rigid, the fake pained expression beginning to crack at the corners of his eyes, and Phoebe saw his fingers clench into a fist beneath the table, knuckles gone white, exactly like the day he'd sat in the discipline office at St. Clement when she was fired. Bradley's lawyer asked for a recess. The board refused. The chair turned to Bradley and asked, "Dr. Whitman, would you like to explain?" Bradley opened his mouth, and Phoebe knew he was about to lie, knew he'd prepared the answer, knew he'd say someone had used his account, that the system had been hacked, that it was a technical error, because Bradley Whitman had lied his entire life, and lying was the only thing he did better than Phoebe. "I didn't edit that record," Bradley said, voice steady, eyes locked on the board. "My account may have been accessed without authorization. I'm requesting further investigation." And at that exact moment, the hearing room door opened. No knock, no request. The heavy oak door swung slowly inward, and a man stepped inside, tall, thin, hair completely silver, back straight though he was past 70, a hard, angular face, severe, with blue-gray eyes. Phoebe recognized immediately because they were an older version, 30 years older, of the eyes sitting on the other side of the room. Dr. Warren Whitman, neurosurgery legend, a St. Clement board member, Bradley Whitman's father. No one had invited him. No one had announced his arrival. He had come on his own, and the way he entered, measured, imposing, looking at no one but his son, told Phoebe he'd read Marcus Webb's article, he'd seen the audit log, he'd seen the footage, and he understood everything. Warren Whitman didn't take a seat in the audience. He pulled a chair into the center of the room, placed it where everyone could see him, and sat down. Then he looked at Bradley. Only looked. He didn't speak. Those blue-gray eyes held his son with a gaze Phoebe couldn't fully read, because it carried too much at once. Anger, disappointment, pain, and something deeper than all of it. Perhaps the realization that he himself had created what now sat across the room. Bradley saw his father. And the mask broke. It didn't break slowly. It shattered instantly, like bulletproof glass hit in the one vulnerable spot. Because Bradley Whitman could lie to the board, lie to the press, lie to the world. But he couldn't lie with his father sitting 10 feet away, staring into his eyes. In silence. Warren Whitman's silence weighed more than any accusation. Bradley opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't steady anymore. It trembled, cracked, and fell apart word by word, like a drowning man trying to breathe. "I edited the record," Bradley said, eyes not on the board, not on Phoebe, not on his lawyer, Only on his father. Owen almost died because of me. I changed the anesthesia dosage in the chart to make it look like Dr. Ashford's mistake. I did it because I wanted her gone from the hospital. The room went dead quiet. No breathing. No rustling paper. Only Bradley's voice, shaking, breaking, and wet eyes fixed on his father. I hated her, Bradley went on, his voice now nearly a whisper. Not because she did anything wrong, but because every time she succeeded, every time she took a case no one else dared to touch, every time the surgical unit clapped when she walked out of the operating room, I heard your voice in my head. I heard you asking, "Why can't you do what she can? Why aren't you as good as she is? Why are you—" A sob cut through him. "Why are you my son, and still less than a girl who had risen from the ashes with nothing but her own will?" Silence. Long. Heavy. Then Dr. Warren Whitman stood up. Slowly. His back still straight. His face unreadable. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at his son again. He pushed the chair back into place, turned away, and walked out of the hearing room. The oak door clicking shut behind him. A small sound the whole room heard, and that click sounded like something closing forever between a father and a son. Bradley stared at the closed door. Then he bowed his head. His shoulders collapsed. His spine folded. And for the first time, Phoebe didn't see Bradley Whitman as an enemy. She saw a child grown up under the shadow of a father too great, a father who never said the 3 words, "I'm proud of you." The board announced its decision 2 hours later. Bradley Whitman's medical license was permanently revoked, and his file was referred to the justice system for criminal prosecution for intentionally endangering a patient. Linda Voss was terminated from St. Clement effective immediately. The allegation of illegal practice against Dr. Phoebe Ashford was dismissed, on the grounds that the surgery for the pediatric patient Stella Mercer was classified as an extraordinary medical emergency, in which the patient faced imminent risk of death, and no other physician was capable of performing the procedure. Dr. Phoebe Ashford's license was fully reinstated, effective immediately. Phoebe heard the ruling, gave a small nod, then stood and walked out of the room. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply walked down the hallway, past where Bradley Whitman still sat alone on a bench, head lowered, shoulders slumped, and in the brief moment as she passed, she didn't see the man who'd framed her. She saw the child no one saved, because that child's father had been busy being a legend. St. Clement Hospital called Phoebe 3 days after the hearing, but it wasn't the call she'd imagined. It wasn't a sincere apology or a ceremonious invitation to return. It was the voice of a new board member, the one who had taken Linda Voss's seat, polite but careful, saying the hospital acknowledged the hearing's outcome, that they respected Dr. Ashford's clinical skill, but that given the current climate and the media reports about Dr. Ashford's connection to organized crime, the hospital needed time to consider before making an official decision. Time to consider. Phoebe understood that language. It meant they were afraid. Afraid of Kane Mercer's name touching the hospital's name. Afraid parents would read the headlines and pull their children out. Afraid of a Mafia scandal more than the truth that a gifted surgeon had been framed. What St. Clement didn't anticipate was the power of small people. Owen's family, the 5-year-old boy who had nearly died because of an anesthesia dose, Bradley altered on paper, spoke first. Owen's mother wrote a long letter to the board, explaining that her son had almost died not because of Dr. Ashford, but because of the person who edited the chart to set Dr. Ashford up, that she had believed the hospital for weeks and now felt betrayed, that she demanded the hospital apologize to her family and bring Dr. Ashford back immediately. The letter was shared on social media. Within 24 hours, more than 30 families whose children Phoebe had operated on contacted the hospital, some by phone, some by email, some showing up in person, all saying the same thing. Dr. Ashford saved my child and we want her back. The medical community spoke up as well. 4 of Boston's top neurosurgeons sent a joint letter to the board, stating that failing to keep Dr. Ashford was a loss to the entire field. The hospital gave ground. But when they called Phoebe a second time, this time with a different tone, gentler, more respectful, and invited her back to her old position with full restoration of benefits and privileges, Phoebe didn't say yes right away. She set conditions, not about salary or title. 3 conditions that she said the hospital had to meet, or she would rather be a doctor in a community clinic than return to a place that had thrown her into the street without blinking. First, the patient record system had to be secured with dual encryption, so no one could alter a chart after the attending physician signed off without two-factor authentication and an automatic audit trail, so there would never be another Owen. Second, the hospital had to create a whistleblower protection fund, so any physician who discovered wrongdoing would have a safe place to speak without fearing retaliation the way she had. Third, the hospital had to issue a public apology to Owen's family, not through lawyers or a sealed settlement, but face-to-face, acknowledging that their son had nearly died because of internal misconduct, not because of Dr. Ashford. The hospital agreed to all three. That afternoon, Phoebe went to see Stella one last time before the girl was discharged home. Stella sat up in bed, black hair beginning to grow back at the base of her skull, big bright eyes, cheeks far rosier than the first day Phoebe met her, holding a crayon drawing, more careful and detailed than her earlier ones, as if she had spent a long time on it. Stella offered it to Phoebe with both hands, the way children hand over the most precious gift they have. In the picture, a blonde woman in blue stood beside a black-haired girl, and above the woman's head, there was a large golden star. "You fixed my head," Stella said in her clear voice, then pointed to the star. "I drew the star because you're the best." The other doctors all shook their heads. Only you nodded. Phoebe took the drawing, and she had to bite her lip hard to keep from crying in front of a child who had just been saved, because that picture, with its crayon lines on white paper, was worth more than any plaque hanging on a hospital wall. Kane waited for her in the hallway. He stood alone, no Renner, no bodyguards, wearing a simple black shirt, and when Phoebe stepped out, he looked at her with those eyes that had seen too much, which she'd learned to read over the past weeks. Eyes no longer cold like the night he knocked on her Dorchester door, no longer cracked open the way they had been when Stella's life was slipping away, but calm, deep, holding something Phoebe wasn't sure she should name. Kane spoke, his voice low but lighter than usual. "You know what I've lived on my whole life? Money, fear, people doing what I want because they're too afraid to do anything else. But you made me believe in something different, something I didn't know still existed. Clean hands. Hands that do what's right not because they're paid or forced, but because it's right, and you used those hands to save the only thing I love in this world, silence." Phoebe looked at Kane and didn't know what to say, because every sentence she could think of felt too small for this moment. Kane watched her for another beat, then nodded once, turned, and walked toward the elevator. He pressed the button. The doors opened. He stepped inside, and before the steel doors slid closed, Kane turned his head and looked back at Phoebe. He looked longer than necessary. He looked in a way Phoebe had seen 1,000 times in movies, and had never imagined she'd be the one standing there receiving it in real life. Then the elevator doors closed, and Kane Mercer disappeared behind cold steel, leaving Phoebe alone in the quiet hallway, Stella's crayon drawing in her hands, her chest holding something that beat faster than normal, something she knew wasn't surgical adrenaline. That night, Phoebe and Zoe walked home. The same street, the same sidewalk, the same 2 pairs of feet, one in worn flat shoes with scuffed heels, one tiny pair in star-patterned sneakers, but everything was different. The last time they'd walked this way, it had been under harsh midday sun, Phoebe clutching a box of personal belongings, eyes raw, heart heavy, and the future ahead of her reduced to a single number, $847. This time, a Boston sunset laid an amber warmth over everything, the kind of light photographers call the golden hour. When the sun isn't blinding anymore, it's gentle, holding the city for a moment before it lets go. Phoebe wasn't holding a box. She was holding Stella's crayon drawing, carefully rolled and tucked into her coat pocket, and with her other hand she held Zoe's. In that same pocket was the stethoscope engraved with her name, the one she would wear again tomorrow when she walked back into St. Clement, not as a doctor who'd been forgiven, but as a doctor who'd proven she was right. Zoe swung her mother's hand in rhythm with their steps, her sneakers bouncing along the pavement, and then, out of nowhere, she asked in a soft voice, "Mom, are you happy?" Phoebe looked down at her daughter, pale blonde hair catching the sunset, clear blue eyes lifted to her, waiting, and Phoebe smiled. The first smile in weeks with no bitterness in it, no hidden tears behind it. "Yes, I'm happy." "Happy about what?" Zoe asked. "Because I didn't lose the most important thing." "What thing?" Phoebe stopped, knelt until she was level with Zoe's eyes, exactly like the moment she'd knelt in that hospital hallway on the day she was fired. But this time, there were no tears, no tight throat, Only peace. She lifted her hands in front of Zoe. Small, pale, thin hands. Hands that had once tried to stop her father's bleeding on West Virginia dirt. Hands that had held newborn Zoe in a quiet recovery room. Hands that had drawn 6 surgical phases on a napkin at 2 a.m. Hands that had lifted a tumor off the brainstem of a 7-year-old child. And she said, "These hands. And you." Zoe looked at her mother's hands, then took them, her small hand wrapping around Phoebe's fingers. And she nodded, the way children nod when they're serious and certain, as if she'd just heard a truth she'd always known, but only now had been spoken out loud. They stood and kept walking. The sunset stretched their shadows across the sidewalk, one tall and one small, the same as the very first day but longer, warmer, because evening shadows are always softer than noon shadows. Then Zoe said, in an ordinary, gentle voice, as if she were asking what they'd have for dinner, "Mom, is the gray-eyed man coming back?" Phoebe almost tripped. She looked down at her daughter. Which gray-eyed man, even though she knew exactly who Zoe meant, and she knew her own face had changed because Zoe was looking up at her with that bright, sparkling look of someone who already knows the answer before she asks. Phoebe didn't answer, but she smiled, and she didn't even realize she was smiling. Zoe did. "He's coming back," Zoe said, firm and confident, with that clean intuition only children seem to have. "I know because the way he looks at you is the way you look at me. Like he doesn't want to leave." Phoebe didn't say anything. She only tightened her grip on her daughter's hand a little, and they kept walking along a Boston sidewalk, under a fading sunset, their shadows trailing behind them. 2 golden threads on gray pavement, heading toward the small apartment in Dorchester that would feel warmer tonight than any night before. Because on the kitchen table there wouldn't only be the engraved stethoscope, there would also be a crayon drawing from a black-haired little girl, a worn, handwritten surgical notebook, and the hands the world had tried to take away and couldn't. They had taken her title, her workplace, her income, her reputation. But there was something no one could take. Hands born to save lives. And sometimes, it's only when you lose everything that the world finally realizes you're the one thing it can't do without. Dr. Phoebe Ashford's story ends here, but maybe its message doesn't. In life, there are moments when you do what's right and still pay for it. Moments when the world turns its back on good people. Moments when you wonder if holding on to your conscience is worth it, when everything around you is collapsing. The answer, maybe, lives in the words of a 6-year-old girl. "Stella, being alive means you're a good mom. Whatever people say, doesn't matter." Sometimes the simplest truth comes from the smallest souls. If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself in Phoebe, in Kane, in Zoe, or in any of the characters, please hit the like button to support stories about courage and love. Share this video with the people you care about, because somewhere out there, someone may need to hear that doing the right thing is never wrong, even when the price is painfully high. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications, so you won't miss more moving stories each day. We'd truly love to know how you felt after hearing this story. Which character moved you the most? Which moment made you cry? And if you've been through something similar in real life, if you've been treated unfairly but still chose to do what was right, if you've had to stand alone when the whole world turned away, share your story in the comments below. We read every comment, and we cherish every feeling you share from the bottom of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.